Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a two-game WNBA slate featuring Connecticut versus Indiana and Seattle versus the New York Liberty. This slate does feature two teams that are really good, and the Liberty and Connecticut, and two teams that are kind of rough, in Seattle and Indiana. That said, both these games do have pretty decent spreads, but I do think there's some viable options. Three of the four teams are very good defensively, but Indiana is not. That's the one that isn't. So that is definitely going to be a thing to consider here. Connecticut definitely has a lot of upside because of Indiana's defense. However, the New York Liberty and Seattle, they both push the pace, while Connecticut and Indiana, they both kind of slow the game down. So far this season at least. So I do think the Liberty are the best team on the slate when it comes to fantasy upside. But I do think Connecticut, Seattle, and Indiana have some players that we can consider on this slate. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go team to team here. So we're going to start with New York Liberty because they are the top scoring team on the slate, and Stewart is going to be the top of our play here. Now, she's obviously one of the most expensive players on the slate. In fact, I think she's the most expensive player on the slate. But she has a ton of upside. She's been good against Seattle in the past, and she's also been over the need fantasy points. And for the 5 games last season against them, she has as much upside on the slate as anybody, and that's why she's priced high. But she's also pretty well worth it. She's going to be hard to roster at that price point because there's not a lot of value on the slate, but she is in play if you can figure out how to roster her. Sabrina Ionescu is also a great play on the slate. She's priced up about as high as I'd like her to be, but she's in a good spot here, and she's got a favorable matchup. She's one of two players from this team that I really like. The pace-up game here bodes well for her. She only needs 33 fantasy points to pay off here. Her floor is a little lower than I'd like it to be at 25, but she's definitely capable on this game, and she's been pretty good so far this season. So I think she's a great option on the slate. Looking at the other three starters for this team, Jones, Vandersloot, and Laney Hamilton, all three of these are pretty avoidable because they're just overpriced here, and they struggled in the past against Seattle. I think Seattle's a decent defensive team, and so they're probably not going to be able to stop Stewart and Ionescu, but I think Jones, Vandersloot, and Laney Hamilton will struggle. Maybe one of them doesn't, but trying to figure out which one at this point is pretty tough, especially with just a few games and the fact that Seattle's a pretty decent team from a defensive perspective. They're going to probably pick their poison there. So looking at Connecticut, Thomas is one of the best players on the slate, and for good reason. She's got a lot of upside. She also has the most when it comes to just total statistical probability. Now, she doesn't have the points per game that some of the other players do, but she gets a lot of rebounds and assists, and outside of there's only a handful of players that have that potential today, and she's one of them. So she's a really solid play on the slate. She might be a little bit safer than um, Stewart, who I mentioned from the Liberty. So she definitely looks like an interesting and great play on the slate, and I really like her upside on this one. Then we do have a couple of GPP plays on this team, Carrington being one of them at $7,700. She doesn't have a lot of upside here, but she definitely didn't start last season, which limited her some. But this season, she started 2 games so far, and She's done pretty good, and she had 26 fantasy points against Indiana the first game of the season, and I think this is what she needs today. So I think she's a GPP play. She's not a must play, but it's hard to find a lot of players under $8,000 are worthwhile, and she's definitely one of them. Then we'll look at Bonner here as well for Connecticut. Now, she's overpriced, but she does have some potential today. She has high risk, high reward, as her ceiling is not super high. But I do think Ionescu is a much more favorable option and about the same price point. So while I do think she has some upside, she's definitely high risk, high reward. Jones and Harris, the other two starters for this team, are largely avoidable today. They have not done much to warrant uh, being useful here. Harris being a starter has not really helped her fantasy output at all. So until we get some better things going for them, they're pretty avoidable. The only advantage to Connecticut is they're playing Indiana, who really doesn't seem to play much defense. Looking at Seattle, this does feature the one injury concern we have, and that's Agwu Mike. Now, she is questionable. I think she's closer to doubtful, but she didn't play yesterday, but maybe she ends up playing today. If she plays, then Russell and Mag Bear Mag Begor would have a tougher time being really good. However, I do think even if she plays, she might be somewhat limited, so she's pretty avoidable on the slate regardless. Especially at her price point being just pretty expensive. She is capable, obviously, but I think the other options at over 10,000 are just better. Diggins Smith is a GPP play for this team. She's started the season pretty well. She doesn't need a ton of fantasy points. She needs around 30 fantasy points to pay off here. Matchup isn't ideal, but her ceiling's a little bit lower than I'd like for her price, but she's definitely in play as she's one of the cheaper options that are actually somewhat viable. Now, Magbergog, sorry for butchering her name. She's been solid so far this season, despite the fact that she is got a lot of good talent on the team. If Agwu Mike is ruled out, that would give her a big boost, though, as she did well in the last game. However, she does kind of need that as her other fantasy perspective is a little bit too low to be super viable here. She's very borderline being a core player, GPP play, so if Agbu Mike is out, then that would definitely boost her up into a core play type of scenario. But right now we'll have to wait and see on that. Looking at Lloyd, she's also a GPP play for this team. This is a tough matchup for them, but I do think she has some upside today. And her range today is 28 to 43 fantasy points. She needs 37 to pay off, which is right in the middle. So I think she's high risk, high reward, but she is a GPP play, very borderline to being a extreme GPP play on the slate. Looking at the other options for this team, Vivian's, she's very avoidable. Horston does have a little upside today, but it's pretty avoidable as well. And then Russell, if she was to start, she would have some potential, but she's really not even viable unless she starts. And her ceiling is barely good enough, even if she starts, to really pay off. So she'd be high risk, high reward potentially. Look at Indiana. This is going to be a frustrating game for them because Connecticut's one of the best defensive teams in the WNBA, and they got absolutely stomped the first time out. But Caitlin Clark is playing a little bit better, so that does help. Boston is an extreme GPP play for this game. In fact, I feel like a lot of players on this team are extreme GPP plays because they have low floors and good ceilings. It's hard to like the matchups, but Boston has upside, and while she had a really bad game against Connecticut to start the season, and she's really kind of struggled to start the year. Of course, they've had a really tough schedule. I do think she does have some extreme GPP upside. Caitlin Clark is probably my favorite play from the team. She has really had some ups and downs to start the season. She had one really bad game against New York, but she also got a good game against New York. So they're obviously Indiana is one of the worst teams in the WNBA, but she has that peripheral stats, with rebounds and assists that she can get. She didn't do that much in the first game. Connecticut really clamped down on her, and she struggled there, but she still managed to score some points, which she'll do most nights. And at her price point, she needs about 32 fantasy points to pay off. And she's not been too far off that, so I think she's capable of that as well. She does have a pretty good ceiling, but this matchup is really rough, so she's a GPP only play. Smith and Samuelson both carry extreme GPP only plays, and Smith has been solid at times versus Connecticut in the past, but she definitely has some risk here. She has good rebounding numbers, which helps, but she has a low floor and not that high of a ceiling, so she's not a great play, but she's interesting. Samuelson for Indiana is one of the few sub $6,000 players that I could find that's even semi reasonable. I still don't even think she gets the 3.5x that she needs, which is around 19 fantasy points. But she did pretty well against the Liberty in the last game, and I think if she plays well, she has some potential. Now she had some injury concerns in the first game against the Liberty, and she did okay, uh, getting some rebounds and assists in the first game of the season against Connecticut. Though she doesn't get any blocks and steals yet so far. The fantasy points are definitely not high, but there's not hardly any value on the slate at all, and she's probably the best sub $6,000 play on the whole slate. Then we'll look at Mitchell for Indiana. I really wanted to make her a core play today, but she has to stay in the GPP range simply because her minutes are not super locked in as she's coming off a long-term injury, and she started coming off the bench to start the year, and she was doing okay. Last game, she actually came and started, and she had a really good game. She really is somewhat scoring dependent, though, and she does need to get some steals to pay off. and that is a little bit of concern here for fantasy. But she's under $7,000, and there's really almost nobody under that price range that's even relatively reasonable. So she is reasonable, and she should get the minutes today, and so that gives her a lot of potential on the slate. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.